At the dawn of the first millennium, the Cannock area was a sparsely populated part of the kingdom of the Cornavai tribe. An ancient route, Blake Street, believed to be one of the oldest roads in the country, crossed Cannock Chase. Its origins are obscure, but it's believed to be part of an ancient saltway, providing a packhorse route carrying salt from Droitwich to the north. On the highest point of Cannock Chase are the remains of a stronghold of the Iron Age occupants of the region. At 8 acres, the sheer scale of Castle Ring, as it's known, suggests that it was a site of some considerable importance to the Cornavai. At times of danger from neighbouring tribes, the scattered population of the region, along with their livestock, would withdraw to the safety of the hill fort. But it's also thought that Castle Ring may have had some special spiritual significance. Cannock was then a gloomy, remote wilderness, part of the extensive primeval Forest of Arden that stretched across the Midlands from the Forest of Dean to Sherwood Forest. It was the custom among continental Celtic societies to choose remote central locations as the strongholds of their priestly elite, the Druids. Castle Ring would have been a fitting place for the abode of the Archdruid of Britain, the sanctum sanctorum of ancient Druidism. The name Cannock is thought to come from Knock, an ancient word meaning high place, maybe referring to something more than just its physical position. Perhaps it was here that the Druids practiced their pagan religious rites, which included human sacrifice. All the sacrifices in the world, though, couldn't protect the Celts from the might of the legions of the Roman Emperor Claudius, who invaded Britain in 43 AD. The most lasting legacy of the Roman period was their remarkable system of roads. The Great Watling Street that ran west from London passed through the south of the Cannock region, and the Ricknield Street ran to the east. Where these two main Roman highways crossed, a sizable settlement known as Lettuce Eaton developed. Substantial remains of the baths and hotel still exist and have given their name to the modern village of Wall. Remains of Ricknield Street are still visible in Sutton Park, that in Roman times was indistinguishable from Cannock Chase. In the early 5th century, after nearly 400 years of occupation, Roman troops were recalled to defend Rome itself from barbarian attack. This left Britain a sitting duck for a new breed of invader. Tribes of Angles, Saxons and Jutes sailed across the North Sea and began pushing the Romano-British population further and further west, and eventually into the Celtic fringes of Cumbria, Cornwall and Wales. The name Wales comes from Whelas, Anglo-Saxon for strangers. As the land of the Angles was consolidated, 7 major kingdoms emerged, with the central area, Mercia, becoming the dominant force. In 757 AD, Mercia came under the control of a new ruler, Offa, who was to make his kingdom one of the most powerful in Europe. Offa made his base at Tamworth, where he built a lavish palace, and also made Lichfield into an archbishopric to rival those at Canterbury and York. The mighty forest to the east of their capital became a popular hunting ground for the Mercian nobility, who built a royal hunting lodge at Sutton, and made the area now covered by Sutton Park and Cannock Chase a royal forest. Cannock Forest remained more or less in its natural primeval state, except where the English had cleared areas for settlement. Cannock and Rugeley began as forest clearings, as did the numerous hays. A hay was an administrative division of the forest. Another family group settled near to a ford on the ancient Blake Street. Their leader was called Heoden, and the hamlet became known as Heoden's Ford, better known today as Hensford. By the late 8th century, A threat to Mercian supremacy began to loom on the horizon. Viking raids were initially confined to coastal monasteries, but became increasingly frequent and daring, until, in 865 AD, a Danish army launched a full-scale invasion. They landed in East Anglia, turned north and captured York, and then began pushing south. They brought Mercia to its knees, leaving, we're told, hardly a church nor a monastery standing. By 870, they were threatening to overrun England completely. Only Alfred the Great of Wessex stood in their way, and it was he and his heirs that led the Saxon recovery. Mercia was liberated from the Danes by Ethelfleda, Alfred the Great's granddaughter. In 913 she fortified Tamworth, and 3 years later built castles at Wednesbury and Stafford, forming a defensive triangle encompassing the forest of Cannock. It was a nephew of Ethelfleda, Athelstan, that became the first true king of the English, uniting the country under the House of Wessex. The Danes, though, remained a constant thorn in the side of the English hierarchy, and when King Edmund died in 1017, Canute of Denmark asserted his authority over the whole of England. His thoughts were regularly hunted in Cannock, and it's been dubiously claimed that the name derives from Canute's oak. Canute introduced harsh forest laws to protect the game within. If any freeman chases a beast of the forest and makes it pant, he shall forfeit 10 shillings to the crown. If he not be a freeman, he pay double, and if he be a bondman, he shall lose his skin. At the time of the Norman conquest, Cannock was back in English hands, under Earl Edwin, a grandson of Lady Godiva of Coventry. Edwin took part in the last serious English rebellion against William the Conqueror, and ended up fighting alongside Hereward the Wake on the Isle of Ely. The uprising was eventually crushed in 1071, and Earl Edwin's property forfeited to the crown. In reprisal for the rebellion, the Normans from their stronghold at Stafford devastated Staffordshire, and the Domesday Book compiled in 1086 shows that there were just 8 peasant families working 240 acres of land in Cannock. The state of the region is summed up in this description of Lichfield. A poor little place, surrounded only by woods and some 40 acres of meadow. The canons had dwindled down to 5, noted as much for poverty as for piety. Wild havoc was made in the Bishop's Woods by the Conqueror. It was decreed that bishops should be based in major areas of population, and the Bishop of Lichfield moved his seat firstly to Chester and later to Coventry. The bishops of Coventry and Lichfield would exert an influence over Cannock for centuries to come. Under the Normans, Cannock Forest continued as a royal hunting ground, with the harsh forest laws enforced by the king's representative. Henry I built a hunting lodge in Cannock Wood, near to Castle Ring, known as the King's House, a substantial place suitable for the king and a considerable retinue. Harsh forest laws and regular royal visits, though, didn't deter poachers completely, and Cannock seems to have had its own self-styled, if pale, imitator of the legendary Robin Hood. One account of the exploits of Thomas Bromley describes an encounter between the infamous poacher and Walter de Elmden, the king's forester, and his companion, Roger de Peasham. The two caught Bromley red-handed in the act of stealing a deer. Bromley took to an oak tree and shot arrows at them until they took him by force and delivered him to the custody of Bridgnorth Castle. Whether he had any merry men to rescue him isn't known, but certainly the fame achieved by his illustrious contemporary was denied to Thomas Bromley. In 1126 the manor of Sutton was acquired from Henry I by Roger de Newburgh, Earl of Warwick, in exchange for estates in Rutland. The hunting grounds that went with the manor reverted to the less important status of chase, as the term forest denoted royal ownership. This presented certain questions about the rights of the new lord. Cannock Forest to the northwest was still owned by the king, and as such its deer were protected by much stricter laws. The problem for Lord Roger was that there was no obvious boundary between his chase and Cannock Forest. A clause was inserted into the transfer deed that enabled him to have liberty to pursue deer that fled from his chase at Sutton into the King's Forest at Cank. In 1189, Richard I, the Lionheart, needing to raise money for his crusade in the Holy Land, sold part of Cannock Forest, including the town, to the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield. As in Sutton, the former royal forest now assumed the status of chase. The bishops built a palace near Upper Longden in the Lichfield district. They called it Beau Desert, beautiful wilderness. By now, Cannock Town was growing in local importance, due mainly to its position at the junction of the roads from Penkridge, Stafford, Rugeley, Walsall and Wolverhampton. A chapel existed here by the 12th century, probably founded as a dependency of Penkridge Collegiate Church. The remains of a preaching cross in the existing churchyard probably predates the chapel and would have provided a focal point for travelling preachers to spread the word among the locals. Cannock was probably already emerging as a market centre when, in 1259, Henry III granted the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield the right to hold a market in the town every Tuesday and an annual 3-day fair on the vigil, feast and morrow of St Michael's, the 15th to the 17th of October. This official seal of approval meant that tolls and fines from the market now swelled the coffers of the bishop, and it was in his own interest to promote his new undertaking. One group who benefited from the expansion of the town's market were the local sheep farmers. The thin soil of the Cannock area is, in the main, suitable only as grazing land, and sheep farming was the region's main industry. The original oval shape of Cannock's marketplace is a typical feature of market towns in sheep-rearing areas. Another important focus of town life was the corn mill that gave Mill Street its name. The mill was powered by a pool fed by Riddings Brook and was where locals came to grind their corn, paying the bishop for the privilege, of course. Another nice little earner for the bishop provides the first mention of an industry that in later centuries would transform the region. Records show that in 1306 he was leasing picks in a coal mine at Beau Desert. Since the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield had acquired the manor of Cannock, disputes had frequently arisen with the canons of Penkridge over jurisdiction of the chapel here. A fragile agreement had been reached whereby the Dean of Penkridge conceded the right to Lichfield to appoint the priest, but retained the lucrative right to bury Cannock's dead. The Dean and Chapter of Lichfield, though, wouldn't be satisfied until they had sole jurisdiction over Cannock, and in 1330 they had a graveyard secretly consecrated here. From now on, despite protestations from Penkridge, Cannock would bury its own. Perhaps to consolidate its new status, St Luke's was extensively rebuilt. Although the church has been added to over the centuries, the nave dates from this 14th century rebuilding, and some 12th century masonry from the original chapel can still be found at the west end of the North Aisle. At least one local had cause to rue St Luke's new status. On the 19th of February 1415, William Griffin of Cannock was charged with adultery with Joan Draycott. It was decreed that he should go in procession, clad only in his shirt, around the church on 3 successive days, and kiss the church step while receiving a castigation from the priest with his rod. Others had cause to be thankful to the church. A wealthy local had left land which provided an endowment for a chantry priest who sang Mass daily for the soul of the benefactor, and also ran a free grammar school for parishioners' children. But widespread changes were about to sweep through the ecclesiastical organisation of England. Henry VIII's desire to ditch his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had caused a rift with the Pope, who refused to sanction a divorce. The king took matters into his own hands, declaring himself head of the Church in England, and effectively granting his own divorce. Institutions and organisations with allegiance to Rome were dissolved and their assets seized. The men charged with carrying out Henry VIII's reforms left no stone unturned in their mission to eradicate the Pope's influence in England. Even Cannock's modest parish church didn't escape their attention. Records show that the items taken included one patterned gilt chalice, one vestment of red silk, one vestment of green silk, and a number of bells. A major victim of the Reformation was Coventry Cathedral, which was not only dissolved but razed to the ground. The bishop was forced to surrender his estates, including Cannock, which, in 1546, was sold by Henry VIII to Sir William Paget, son of a Wednesbury nail-maker. Paget was a wily operator who had risen through the ranks of one of the king's new men, while retaining, secretly, his Catholic faith. Sir William moved into the old bishop's palace, assuming the title Baron Paget of Beaudesert, and quickly set about cashing in on his new estate, beginning a process that would change the appearance of Cannock Chase beyond recognition. He established furnaces and forges in Furness Coppice, and introduced a radical new smelting process which required vast quantities of wood to produce charcoal. Large areas of woodland were fenced off, and traditional grazing land was lost, causing severe hardship among local sheep farmers. The new baron also developed the existing coal mine on his estate, and Beaudesert achieved distinction for the depth of its workings. Following the succession of the Catholic Queen Mary, the ancient faith enjoyed a revival, and Lord Paget became a bulwark for Catholicism in Staffordshire. Under the Protestant Elizabeth I, though, the situation reversed, and Catholics again found themselves persecuted. The Cannock area continued as a stronghold of the old faith, and Beaudesert was searched time and again for papists said to be in hiding there. In 1583, the third Lord Paget, Thomas, was instrumental in a plot to bring Mary Queen of Scots to the throne. His estates were confiscated, and the family fled the country. Disgruntled local sheep farmers took the chance to revenge the loss of their pastures. Woodland hedges and fences were burned, forest workers beaten, and sheep allowed back in to graze. But their triumph was short-lived. The Paget's ironworks were leased to a favourite courtier of Queen Elizabeth, Fulk Greville, who proved even more vigorous than Lord Paget in his exploitation of the chase. Thousands of acres of wood were felled to fuel his furnaces, and after 7,000 years, almost overnight, the landscape was transformed into a barren, treeless heath. Meanwhile, in exile, the Pagets, in particular Charles, brother of Thomas, continued to plot against the Protestant religion in England. Charles was formally charged with treason for a string of failed attempts to overthrow Queen Elizabeth in favour of Mary Stuart. Only the King of France's refusal to hand him over saved him from the chop. When Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England in 1603, although a Protestant, the new king restored the Paget estates, and Charles returned to Beaudesert. The king soon had cause to question his judgment. In 1605, a Catholic plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament, and James I with it, was foiled at the last minute. A number of prominent Midland families were charged with treason for their involvement in the gunpowder plot. Charles Paget escaped prosecution, but, given his track record, it seems almost inevitable that he played some part. The incident brought on a new wave of persecution. £100 reward, a huge sum in those days, was offered for exposing papists, and Cannock probably provided both shelter for many Catholics and the opportunity for those who knew their whereabouts the chance to cash in. In 1642, friction between King Charles I and Parliament finally boiled over into full-scale civil war when the King raised his standard at Nottingham. The situation in Staffordshire demonstrated the remarkable divisions created in this extraordinary period. Stafford town became a parliamentarian stronghold, while the community at the castle remained staunchly royalist. Lichfield was besieged and changed hands a number of times, with serious damage to the cathedral. Inevitably, with so much activity going on around it, Cannock was dragged into the conflict. The Pagets of Beaudesert fought for the king, and John Birch, attorney of Cannock, was imprisoned by the parliamentarians. His estates, including land and rents in Leecroft and land in Cannock, were sequestered, having already been twice plundered by royalists. In 1646, the people of Cannock witnessed the action at first hand, when Roundhead cavalry from Stafford and a royalist force from Lichfield clashed in the town. The first stage of the English Civil War ended in 1649, when Charles I was beheaded by the victorious parliamentarians. 11 years of strict puritanical rule ended with the death of Oliver Cromwell in 1660 and the subsequent restoration of Charles II. By the close of this eventful century, Hensford comprised of 53 households and Cannock 86, and other small settlements began to appear. In 1709, Robert Wedge created grain mills on the Riddings Brook. The hamlet that grew up here was thereafter known as Wedge's Mills. Meanwhile, the nearby Watling Street was growing increasingly busy. A common sight on the route were drovers bringing their cattle from as far away as Ireland to the expanding London market. The status of the Paget family of Beaudesert went up a notch in 1714, when Henry Paget was created Earl of Uxbridge. The Earl was one of a number of prominent locals, instrumental in solving one of Cannock's age-old problems. The town stands on gravelly soil, which allows rainfall to drain off very quickly, and summertime water shortages were a frequent nuisance. It was claimed that Cannock often contained more ale than water. In 1736, Dr. William Birch of Leecroft Hall donated a spring on his land on Rumour Hill to the people of Cannock. A trust fund was set up, with Dr. Birch donating £60 and the Earl of Uxbridge, the Bishop of Worcester and others all chipping in to raise £478 9 shillings. Work began in 1736, and the Cannock Conduit Trust continued to supply the town with fresh water until 1942, when subsidence finally crushed the pipeline. It's thought that the bowling green, reputedly one of the finest in England, was laid down at the same time as the water supply was provided. At this time, the main road over Cannock Chase was still the ancient Blake Street. A major landmark on the route was the Cross Keys at Hensford, a busy port of call for wagons, pack horses and stagecoaches. Travelling the roads of England in the mid-18th century could be an extremely hazardous business, as this contemporary report indicates. John Smith of Drayton and his nephew were crossing the Chase after a heavy fall of snow, when they fell with their horses into a deep pit, where they remained for 2 days, and were taken out but without any signs of life. The state of the roads in these days meant that stagecoach travel was a slow, tortuous process. The coach journey from Lichfield to London took 2 days in summer and 4 days in winter. Coach companies never stipulated times of arrival and always carried the warning, "if God permit." The main problem was that responsibility for roads and bridges fell on the parish in which they lay. Raising money for such things was always difficult, and most of the country's roads were in a sorry state of repair. But schemes that would revolutionise transport were underway. Groups of landowners and businessmen began to join forces to privately improve sections of highway in their locality, recouping their outlay by erecting turnpike gates and toll houses to charge those using them. Thomas Fletcher, proprietor of the George Hotel in Walsall, recognised that a new turnpike road through Walsall would boost his trade no end. In 1781 he got parliamentary permission to construct a road from Birmingham to Stafford, passing through Walsall and Cannock. Within a short time, coaches between London and Liverpool passed through Cannock every day, and twice a day between London and Manchester. Town centre inns like the Crown Hotel and the Royal Oak were enlarged to cater for the massive increase in business brought in by the stagecoaches. The arrival of the London coaches became quite an event, with crowds of locals gathering at the main coaching inns to hear the hot news from the capital. In spite of the improvement brought about by turnpiking, crossing the Chase could still be a daunting experience, and the curfew bell continued to be rung in Cannock to guide people over the wilderness. In one recorded incident, a Cannock to Stafford coach overturned near Bednall Head, dumping a lady passenger into the lap of a drunken sailor. The passengers had to finish their journey to Stafford on foot. Another concern was the constant threat of highway robbery. The population of Chesley-in-Hay, originally a squatter settlement, was said to include a strong criminal element with at least one notorious highwayman. The new road over Cannock Chase diverted traffic away from Blake Street and marked a sharp downturn in the fortunes of the Cross Keys at Hensford, although the inn was to replace some of its lost trade with a new industry. The Hensford Hills became a popular location for training racehorses, with the Cross Keys providing high-quality stabling. As the area's reputation grew among the racing fraternity, Anglesey Lodge was built by Edmund Peel of Tamworth as a summer residence and to provide further stabling for racehorses. At its peak, 120 horses a year were trained at Hensford, including 4 Grand National winners. Cannock's position on the Birmingham to Stafford turnpike had brought about a gradual expansion, and the town's population had grown to just over 1,100, living in 224 houses. The stagecoaches that now thundered through Cannock on a regular basis were fine for passengers and light goods, but transporting bulky loads was still a slow and expensive business. A load of Staffordshire coal that could be bought for 4 shillings at the pithead, by the time it reached London, cost 40 shillings. The success of the Duke of Bridgewater's canal, which brought coal from his pits at Worsley into Manchester, sparked a new transport revolution, and canal mania gripped the country. A canal linking the rivers Trent and Mersey was completed in 1777, followed quickly by the Staffordshire and Worcestershire. This ran from Great Haywood on the Trent and Mersey to Stourport on the Severn, linking 3 of the country's major navigable rivers. The main network of the region's canal system was completed with the Worley and Essington that served the mining areas of Birchills and Wensfield and joined the Birmingham Canal near Wolverhampton. Among the local businessmen to take advantage of this opening up of the Cannock area was Edgestall manufacturer William Gilpin, who relocated to a site alongside the Staffordshire and Worcester Canal at Wedges Mills. The hamlet began to expand around the factory, and these workers' back-to-backs were some of the last in the region to be demolished. The fortunes of the Pagets were also in the ascendancy. In 1815, Another Henry was made Marquis of Anglesey for his part in the Battle of Waterloo, although he lost a leg for his troubles. The early 19th century also saw Cannock enjoy a brief spell as a fashionable health resort due to the reputed health-giving properties of the mineral waters on Rumour Hill. But it was the existence of another mineral that was to have a major impact on the region. By the mid-19th century, the expansion of the industries of Birmingham and the Black Country had caused a huge increase in the demand for coal and shown up the inability of the South Staffordshire mines to meet demand. Eyes now turned to the deeper seams on Cannock Chase, made more accessible by the creation of the canal system. The Marquis of Anglesey was quick to capitalise on the situation, and in 1850 opened the Uxbridge Colliery near Hensford. But it was a small group of entrepreneurs, notably William Harrison and John Robinson Maclean, that really opened up the Cannock Chase coalfields. Maclean was instrumental in forming the Cannock Chase Company that in 1852 leased the Uxbridge mine. To aid the distribution of Cannock coal, the local canal network was expanded. Cannock Chase Reservoir, better known as Chasewater, was created as a feeder for the canal system, and the Anglesey branch of the Worley and Essington Canal built to serve the Uxbridge Colliery. By the late 1850s, the Cannock extension was completed, followed by the Churchbridge extension to join up with the Staffordshire and Worcestershire Canal. This marked the end of canal building in the region, because by now a new transport revolution was underway, springing, appropriately, from the early days of coal mining. Transporting the bulky products of collieries from the point of extraction to the customer had always been a problem. Pack horses had originally been used, but in the 17th century wheels were attached to rectangular baskets and pulled by horses. It was soon realised that these wagons ran better along the existing ruts, and the idea of railways was born. The harnessing of steam power provided the final piece of the jigsaw, and since George Stephenson had built the first commercial railway between Stockton and Darlington, the idea had spread like wildfire. In 1849, the South Staffordshire Railway Company completed the Walsall to Lichfield line, which it hoped would provide a link between the Black Country, Derbyshire and the North East. These aims were thwarted by the Midland Railway, and the Staffordshire Company concentrated on developing the potential of coal traffic on the Cannock Chase coalfield. On the 1st of February 1858, the enterprising J.R. Maclean completed a line from the Uxbridge pits near Chasewater to join the SSR at Anglesey sidings. On the same day, the SSR opened their line from Walsall to Cannock for passenger and goods traffic. The railway company started an omnibus service between Cannock and Rugeley until the line was extended to Rugeley in 1860. With the Chase opened up as never before, its coal deposits were exploited to their full, with more pits sunk and railways built to serve them. As people flooded into the area to fill the jobs available, old townships expanded rapidly. Hensford developed as a small town, serving the mining community springing up all over the district, although the town centre shifted from the old town at Hilltop to the new area around the railway station. New townships also appeared. In 1861, the Wolverhampton Building Society bought 30 acres of waste farmland that lay in a triangle formed by Walsall Road and Watling Street. Here they laid the foundations of Bridgetown, named after the bridge that carried the old Roman road over Riddings Brook. Within a few years, the workers at Cornelius Whitehouse's Edgetool factory, the nearby brick and tile works and the colliery lived in the 50 or so houses built on the site. Within 20 years, this had grown to 235 houses, a variety of shops, 2 inns and 5 beer houses, and a little later a church. Bridgetown was declared to be the principal manufacturing place. It was also said You could tell the town afar off by the smoke the stacks of its several larger manufactories pour out, and by the blast and hammer the White House works send forth. Cannock's growth was even more remarkable. A population that in 1861 had stood at less than 3,000, by 1881 had rocketed to more than 17,000. Almost inevitably, these rapid changes were not without their problems. The huge influx of miners was something of a culture shock for respectable locals, who objected to some of the uncouth practices of the newcomers. Miners playing their own form of marbles in the town centre for money, and their children chasing after horses with buckets to collect the droppings to sell as manure, were among the things frowned upon. Not that the respectable residents were slow to exploit the business opportunities that arose. Many local farmers, publicans and businessmen turned landlord by financing the construction of row upon row of terraced housing for rent to miners and their families. A thriving brick and tile industry developed, and local businesses like Charles Linford's shop and builder's merchant prospered. In good times, wages in the Cannock pits were well above average, and the region's miners enjoyed a relatively high standard of living, but the industry was subject to huge fluctuations in demand. Miners were paid per shift with no guaranteed wage. No work meant no money, and regular slumps in the coal industry brought severe hardship on the mining community. Matters were made considerably worse by the widespread use of the truck system, whereby workers were paid in tokens that could only be exchanged for goods in tommy shops owned by the pit owner or his agents. High prices and short measures were the rule rather than the exception.
Concerning tommy shops and the high-field ruffian, for he pays you with a tommy note, you must take that or nothing. That is of the colliers I will tell how they pays each other. Oh, little have they but a tommy note from a 1 week to the other. On Saturday,
for those at the very bottom of the social pile, there was the daunting prospect of the Cannock Union Workhouse on the Wolverhampton Road. This was home to 200 of the most wretched of the region's population. By now, the Cannock region had outgrown its old manorial system of local government, and in 1894, Bridgetown and a number of other suburbs were incorporated into the Cannock Urban District. The Cannock area was now producing half the total coal of South Staffordshire, with up to 20,000 employed in its pits. While parts of Cannock were being turned inside out for its black gold, in 1896, after a long dispute, the future of a small parcel of land at the heart of Cannock town was secured. The green was vested in trustees, 4 appointed by the bowling club and 4 by the Urban District Council, and leased to the club at a peppercorn rent. By 1901, the population of Cannock was approaching 24,000, and the proclamation of the death of Queen Victoria and the accession of Edward VII brought many of them onto the streets of Cannock. The following year, King Edward's coronation was commemorated with the building of the town's first bandstand, adjoining the bowling green. One of the town's best-known citizens in the early 20th century was Dr. J.K. Butter, none the least because he was owner of the very first car in Cannock. In December 1911, the doctor was called to attend an incident every mining community dreaded. Not surprisingly, given the dangers and insecurity of pit life and mine owners' determination to exploit their workforce, friction often boiled over. In 1912, between the 28th of March and the 6th of April, following rioting at Littleton Colliery, 500 men from the West Yorkshire Regiment were billeted in Cannock. There was no further trouble, and locals seemed to welcome this diversion from everyday life. It was reported that the regimental band played in the bandstand each evening, and later Colonel Cayley, the commanding officer, wrote to thank the people of Cannock for making them so welcome. But soon, events in Europe began to dominate the news. 2 huge army training camps were built on Cannock Chase. A branch railway line, nicknamed the Takaroo Express, was hurriedly built from Hensford Station to carry workers building the camps. Up to 250,000 British and Commonwealth troops destined for the trenches passed through, many never to return. Ironically, a large number of those that made it back died in the military hospital on Brindley Heath in a flu epidemic. They were buried in the Commonwealth Cemetery on the Chase. From 1924, miners of the West Cannock Colliery were housed in the former hospital buildings. Within a few years, a school and a club were established, and the hospital chapel rededicated as St Mary's Church. These were the origins of Brindley Village. Prime Minister Lloyd George won the post-war election largely on the promise of building a land fit for heroes for returning servicemen. Unfortunately, the war had left Britain with crippling national debts, and many promises went unkept. Furthermore, the gay abandon of the elite in the Roaring Twenties only served to highlight the huge gulf between the haves and the have-nots. In 1926, the cycle of industrial decline, unemployment and social bitterness led to the worst explosion of class conflict Britain had yet known. For 9 days between the 3rd and 12th of May, the country was at a virtual standstill. Inexplicably, on the 12th of May, the TUC suddenly called off the strike. The miners, feeling betrayed, carried on for several more bitter months. Cannock miners and their families were reduced to digging on the spoil heaps with their bare hands for enough coal to heat their homes, and maybe a bit extra to sell for a few vital coppers. Often, the only chance of a meal for miners' children was at a soup kitchen set up at Lloyd's Butchers in Heathgap Road, Blackford. Lloyd's collected meat donated by Birmingham traders and brought it back to their premises to be cooked. Eventually, hunger and sheer desperation forced the miners back to work. They were paid a shilling less per shift, and the local ringleaders were blacklisted. In 1927, the Urban District Council moved its offices to an 18th century mansion overlooking the bowling green that had once belonged to Dr. Birch, instigator of the Conduit Trust. The building later became part of the Technical College. By the early 1930s, many of Cannock's hastily built workers' houses were unfit for habitation. Many were demolished and new council estates built to replace them. But soon, events on the continent once more began to cast a long shadow over life at home, as the country again geared up for war.
The British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
In 1939, No. 6 School for Technical Training, better known as RAF Hensford, was opened by Secretary of State for Air Sir Kingsley Wood. Thousands of men, and some women, received their basic training here before being posted to all parts of the country. Training at RAF Hensford focused on maintenance of the airframes and engines of RAF planes, vital work in the early days when the fate of Britain hung in the balance. Cannock people did their bit in other ways, raising more than £6,000 towards the cost of a Spitfire. With so many men away fighting, responsibility for keeping the factories going fell on the women. A wartime day nursery was set up in Hallcourt Lane, Cannock, so that mothers could engage themselves in vital war work. The region's coal miners also pulled their considerable weight for the war effort. Cannock Chase's 22 collieries were flat out. Understandably, the end of war was greeted with great jubilation. But the celebrations had hardly finished when the weather contrived to cause more chaos. The severe winter of 1947 saw parts of the Cannock district cut off for more than 6 weeks. The second half of the 20th century was to bring changes to rival those that followed the opening up of the Cannock coalfields a century earlier. 2 main factors started the process: a growing population and a massive increase in car ownership. Watling Street had become increasingly busy, and in the 1950s was widened with an island built at the bottleneck Longford Crossroads. Over the next 2 decades, a whole new road system was built around Cannock to take the pressure off the old narrow streets. The town centre was also changing dramatically. Unfortunately, in the rush to improve, not too much thought was given to conservation, and the ancient Crown Inn was demolished. At the same time, acres of farmland bordering the town were earmarked for housing, and new estates rapidly altered Cannock's traditional rural setting. By 1974, the population of the district had grown to around 78,000, and Cannock Chase District Council was formed from the former Cannock and Rugeley urban districts and the parish of Brindley Heath. The new authority soon outgrew its old offices and moved to a new purpose-built home. The transformation of Cannock continued right up until the end of the 20th century. In 1997, pedestrianisation gave the town centre back to the people and restored some of its traditional market town atmosphere. The recent development of High Green Court has complemented still further Cannock's shopping and office facilities. While decades of sweeping change had transformed the district, the industry that had sparked its initial growth had slipped into an irreversible decline, and by the 1970s was all but dead. The mining heritage left a legacy of old spoil mounds, colliery buildings, mineral railways and disused canal basins, and also devastated the local economy as unemployment soared. For a time, a general feeling of hopelessness and helplessness hung over the Cannock district. But slowly, from the clouds of despair, a vision began to emerge. It was realised that the collapse of mining although a disaster in the short term, in fact provided a unique opportunity to build a new future. Plans were conceived to enhance, protect and conserve the district's environmental character, while at the same time enabling high quality development to take place in the most sustainable way. Concerted efforts were made to reclaim old industrial sites. Slowly but surely, nature, with a huge helping hand, is healing the scars, and in time will provide the region with an enviable collection of green areas. This process is vital to the other crucial part of the local plan. Creating an attractive environment in which to live and work is playing its part in attracting new businesses to the region. Although unemployment is still well above the national average, there are signs that Cannock's economic revival is underway, and another boost may be around the corner. In the past, improvements in the region's fortunes have followed improvements in its communications. As with the coming of the canals and turnpiking, history may be about to repeat itself. Work is underway on the Birmingham Northern Relief Road that, although not welcomed by all, will link Cannock directly to the motorway network and relieve the hopelessly congested A5. The new road will make Cannock District more accessible than it has ever been, and, if the past is anything to go by, may well provide the stimulus for further economic development. Away from, and in complete contrast to, the frantic activity taking place in the south of the region is Cannock's crowning glory. Only a few reminders of the Chase's industrial past remain, and it provides a wonderful retreat from the frenzy of modern life. The challenge now, against mounting pressure from developers, is to preserve the natural, rugged beauty of Cannock Chase for future generations to enjoy.